about 7:02, and so I think we're going to begin. And we have many of our reparation team's members here tonight. I'm Anna Vegan, and Josh Brown, who is primarily worships at HT Loop, couldn't be here today. But Carrie Fleming is here, and Chris Klepper. Chris, how do you say the last name?
It's okay. It's Hippler-Hartwig.
Klepper-Hardwick, Barb Waller, and Margie Shannon. I'm not sure if Margaret Ann is here, but she will be, I think. And we will be recording the presentations, but not Q&A. So please feel free to share your questions and thoughts without worrying that it's all going to be kept forever in infinity. But without further ado, Chris, please begin and with your welcome and prayer.
So we want to welcome everyone. It's so exciting to see folks from all of our worshiping communities, HT Loop, HT Lakeview, and online from many different places. So that is really exciting. We are pleased to have with us tonight Dina Wayne and Mac Austin. Dina is a longtime member of Holy Trinity, and she has a passion for researching our congregational history. She gave a presentational tour in celebration of Holy Trinity's 150th anniversary. Mac Austin is an independent historian focusing on the Chicago and indigenous aspects, researching Holy Trinity's historical records and documents, and she is going to share what she's learned and how Holy Trinity's history shapes our reparations work today. Before we go any further, why don't we all start with a prayer? The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, we pray for this time that we are all gathered, for the learnings that we will receive tonight, for the things that will help us to understand our role in the continuing, not just the history of Holy Trinity, but where we are today and some of the things that we need to be a part of in order to move forward with making peace in our world. Lord, we pray for those who were not able to make it tonight and who are hoping to get to hear the recording so that it will enlighten them also. Lord, we pray for those people who are struggling in their hearts, and we pray for those of us who definitely have questions about the past, the present, and the future. Lord, to all of these, we lay them at your feet, and we accept all of the blessings that you have for all of us. In your good and gracious name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Chris. That was lovely. Carrie, also a member of our reparations team, would you tell us all a little bit about the norms and how we do norms?
I will, thanks. Hi everyone, I'm Carrie Fleming. When we began working at this reparations team, we all came together and we created what we call a set of norms, the list of basic guidelines that we use to, and we read them in the beginning of every meeting, and they're there just to keep us so that we're all on the same track and keep us from going off the rails and to keep us accountable to one another. We're not going to share all of them with you tonight because a good many of them aren't relevant for this presentation, but two that we did want to speak out about are these, and that first of all, that all questions and perspectives are welcome. We don't think that we know there are no silly questions, and we want to hear as many perspectives and places where people are coming from as possible, as long as it's all done with respect. And I trust that that will happen with this group. And secondly, that we're all learners here. None of us here is an expert. There are some of us in this presentation who have more knowledge about certain aspects or certain pieces of say, history and things that are going on with the topic. But we're all here learning, and we're all here trying to understand what this whole thing about reparations is. None of us are really teachers. We're all learning, and we're all on this journey together. And so with that, we'll go into the remainder of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I just want to give you very quick feedback, or not feedback, context that the reparations team has been meeting now for about 2 years, I believe. And last fall, we did a very a well-attended Zoom meeting about what is reparations. And in that, we talked about the curriculum that we've been using, which is called Sacred Reckonings. If you want to know more about that curriculum, it was developed by interfaith and inter-ecumenical pastors and lay leaders in the United States. I'll put the link to that curriculum right here in the chat, and you can tab it and take a look at it another time. But if you remember seeing today in the announcement reminder about today's event, there was an eco map that's on the curriculum, and I can show that to you as well. There are a lot of times people think that reparations is all about money, and certainly thinking about money and how to be responsible and try to repair and heal through financial means is part of it, but it's not all of it. So what I just want to show you here is if I can share my screen, here we go. Within the curriculum on the homepage of Sacred Reckonings is this eco map that was also shared in the email today. So there is the idea of wealth return, and we can talk more about that in coming weeks and months. But before that kind of thing, it's important to know more about ourselves and our history and how we came to be who we are and where we are as a church, as individuals. It also involves rethinking spiritual practices and how we relate to one another and others in the world, and how we show up for one another, especially those who are struggling with systemic inequalities of various kinds. So tonight is one small part of doing this longer work of information sharing and truth telling more about who we are and how we come to be where we are today. So without further ado, I really want to welcome and thank Dina and Mac for being here. And I'd like, Dina's going to lead off and give an abbreviated presentation of what she shared with us a couple weeks ago in leading up to the 150th anniversary. So Dina, please take it away, and you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, just a second here. Okay, how does that look?
Good, and you can do,
go ahead. Should I do that swap thing?
yeah.
Okay, wait. Swap presenter view. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay, so I changed this around a bit because it seemed from a conversation with Anna and Josh that one of the things that they were interested in was sort of, because it kind of comes up when you're thinking about people who haven't had the same opportunities and access to capital that other people have had, where did Holy Trinity in its early years get the money to do sort of, so to speak, all the building that it did? Does someone have their, or is it me? Does someone have like their radio on? Oh, I wonder if I have something on. Can anybody else hear stuff, or are you guys all okay? Okay, so I will try to go along with whatever's in the background because it would take too long to figure out what it is. So in the presentation a couple of weeks ago or whenever it was, I talked about the earliest history of the congregation, and I'll start there again today with a little bit less detail. That it was the attempt for Holy Trinity was going to be an English-speaking congregation, as opposed to German or Norwegian or Swedish. The original congregation met under the direction of the Home Missionary Society of the General Synod of Baltimore, Maryland. And when I've studied, well, really specifically Lutheran church histories, but it's probably true for a lot of churches in Chicago, is really the only place I've studied it. For other churches, a lot of times almost like Holy Trinity in the loop, although not quite, they're kind of mission congregations from somewhere else, right? Somebody else is kind of paying for them to exist and organizing them. And, it might be the Missouri Synod, in this case, the Missionary Society from Baltimore. And, in the Midwest, it was not uncommon to look east because the East is an older part of the country. And that's where, that's where the money was from. So initially it was from Maryland. They built a small church at Monroe and Clark. But you can see in 1859, the mission support ended. And William Passavant, who we'll talk about a little bit more in started supporting the leader of the congregation. So he paid the salary of an early pastor of the church, but they still couldn't make it financially, and they sold their building and the lot that it was on to a Jewish congregation. And then Passavant stepped in again in 1864, and he let them meet in the parlors of a hospital, and I'll show you a picture of that in a bit, that he built at 141 Dearborn Street. You can see that the Reverend Frank Richards became a pastor in 1867, and he was supported by the Pittsburgh Synod of the General Council, so Pennsylvania. And I think Passavant was from Pennsylvania, and I think it's no surprise that synods in Pennsylvania were strong supporters of the early Holy Trinity. There was, of course, the Chicago fire in 1871, and Reverend Richards left Holy Trinity to go off and look for money in the East for a new church building, and a pastor from the Swedish Lutheran Church. I'm not sure where Paxton is, if that's Paxton, Illinois, but in any case, that person pastored the church for a while. The new church in 1872 was simply a storeroom that had been moved from 178 North Clark Street, and it was moved to Dearborn and Erie. So it wasn't like the church had a lot of money to build a new grand structure. They moved a storeroom and they kind of changed it into a church. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And again, it didn't go right to Holy Trinity or to at that time Church of Mercy, because they didn't have any money. The ownership was transferred to the Lutheran Mission and Church Extension Society of the General Council in exchange for money to complete the purchase of the church. In 1875, Holy Trinity was in position to assume the debt, so they did that, and they became owners of the property. In 1878, their debt of, as you can see there, $1,163 about, was forgiven by the mission when Holy Trinity paid them $1, but the society still continued paying for the pastor. In 1872, they purchased the lot where, what is it called, where we just went? LaSalle Street Church. They purchased the lot there, and how did they do that? It was from part of the sale from the Dearborn Erie Church, and then Thiel College in Pennsylvania that also had connections to Passavant, because he had loaned them $12,000 as a mortgage. And I just wanted to, I think the theme of all of this is when you know people, and you know people with money, so to speak, even if it's only a mild amount of money, then you can find your support there. So this was from a Holy Trinity member in 1898. Great sympathy was extended to us by the good Lutherans of the East. St. Mark's Congregation in Philadelphia especially deserves our love and kind remembrance for the ready assistance they gave us, not only during the trying times after the Great Fire, but also subsequent to this time. And that was in 1898, right? So it showed that, the early Holy Trinity really relied on Lutherans in other places to help support them. And I think Pastor Miller can say maybe later, but I think we got for the 25 years ago for the celebration a letter from that church that had supported us during that time. In 1919, the congregation voted to start fundraising for a new building. So just quickly a picture of Passavant. I think we all have some idea by now who he is. He was a pastor. He started the deaconess movement here in the US, sort of bringing it over from Germany. He founded a precursor of one of the organizations that became LSTC, the seminary in 1891, that is where Wrigley Field is now. And again, he really assumed the financial support of the congregation in 1864. Here's Passavant Hospital, where the church worshiped, and then at the time it was called Church of Mercy. So between 1867 and 1871. Here's a picture of it. So this is the warehouse that was moved from 178 North Clark Street and then turned into a church. So nothing, really stupendous. Not sure what's going on with that door. It's kind of interesting, but anyway, that wasn't covered. Dedicated December 1876. This is Mr. Richards, who also went off to the east to get money for the where LaSalle Street Church is now at Elm and LaSalle. This was the church that they built, dedicated in 1888, and lo and behold, they couldn't support, they couldn't pay the mortgage on that, so they sold it in 1912 to get out from under the debt. They joined with St. Mark's Church in 1912. This was a church that also had been started by Passman in 1890 on the site of Wrigley Field and adjacent to that precursor to LSTC. They moved away. The seminary moved to Maywood to get away from sort of the dirt and congestion of the city. And St. Mark's bought a lot at basically our current site. It was known as Maple Street at the time. So Maple and Addison for $4,000. I haven't been able to find reference to where that money came from. Maybe somebody else knows, but I didn't see any reference to that. And in 1912, then, when Holy Trinity had to sell, time's up, had to sell the site where the South Street Church is, they merged with St. Mark's, the picture of the seminary, and then finally our current building. That's our history, yeah, in a nutshell.
That was terrific, Dina. That was that was amazing. How folks you're invited to ask any questions in the chat or just unmute if there are things that you wanted to hear from Dina about or ask a little bit more. We have time for that before Mac presents. Well, ponder, if you wish, some takeaways, things you didn't know, things that you thought were interesting, and we can make some connections with Pastor Craig a little bit after Mac speaks with us. So Mac is an independent researcher and historian that Josh and I and the reparations team found through doing a lot of research about historians in the area. And we couldn't have found somebody with more specific interests and expertise around Chicago history and people and storytelling than Mac. So I'm going to put Mac's website, onehistory.org, into the chat if you want to know more about Mac and her work and the kinds of publications that she has written and been a part of. But she's been so gracious and helpful in telling us more about ourselves than we knew just from the archival, the research that we have in our own possession that Dina has explored so fully. So Mac, thank you for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. That's really kind. And I have to say that the One History website is a little out of date. The links, some of the links don't work. We apologize. We also have One History Primary, which is a little bit more up to date, and that is access to primary sources, which my collaborator and I work a lot on. So now I'm going to share the screen. I am going to hit share and then do presenter view of the slideshow. So can everybody see? Excellent. So this is going to be down and dirty and awfully quick. I'm starting with a very quick overview of the indigenous history of Chicago. And then I'm going into the African-American history of Chicago with a real focus on the housing history and housing inequities. Because that is a lot of the work I did in terms of the research for the Reparations Committee. So to start off, the indigenous history of Chicago. Chicago has always been a trade and transportation hub long before Europeans got here. It's meant to be what it is. It's suited for it. Once Europeans arrived on the East Coast, of course, that set up a lot of chaos for the indigenous people throughout the country. It sort of started east and moved west. So you have a lot of loss of life from disease, which everybody knows about, but you also have a lot of refugees. There was a major war in the 17th century called the Beaver Wars, where the Iroquois Confederacy basically made war in order to capture the beaver market because the Europeans were looking to buy beaver, and a lot of it, and a lot of fur, but mainly beaver. So that sent the three groups of people that we traditionally associate with the Chicago area into the Chicago area. And that is the Illinois, the Miami, and the Potawatomi. The Potawatomi were members of the Council of Three Fires, or they became members of the Council of Three Fires, which was the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe people. So Those were the people who were here when the first European fur traders came, but it's not the way we stereotypically think about it in terms of this Chicago area belonging to one particular group. There were Miami villages in the early 18th century. There were Potawatomi villages. There were hunting grounds for numerous tribes in the area in terms of the greater Chicagoland area. It's one historian referred to it as a polyglot community. There weren't permanent settlements for years and years and years because people moved, but there were farmers. Those farmers were women. Those women gave their extras, sold their extras to the French fur traders, to the US military once the US got involved. So it was a very cosmopolitan area always. By the mid-18th century, the fur trade was up and running and Europeans were, settling here. They were mainly male French fur traders or solely French fur traders, males, and they married Native women and they developed a Métis society. So Chicago became a mixture of Métis families who were very good at trade because the women could translate, the men had access to the European markets, their children were mixed race and became leaders in the community. Many places in Chicago are named after some of these Métis families, including Caldwell, Beaubien, and Wilmette. You have this polyglot community. Then the United States wins the Revolution. Britain gives away this area, the United States comes in, and a few treaties are instituted. The Treaty of Greenville is the first one and the one that affects all of the buildings, as far as I can tell, where the Holy Trinity Church was built. So you see on this map on the lower right that Chicago is this tiny area that is separated out and ceded to the United States government. And the rest of sort of the Ohio Valley is also part of Greenville, Treaty of Greenville. So this shows how important Vincennes, Chicago, some other small areas were to the United States traders. So all of those, the cession in the Treaty of Greenville was 6 miles square from the mouth of the Chicago River. And as far as I can tell, your church is just at the edge of that currently. Now, the other main treaties were the Treaty of St. Louis, where the Indian boundary lines that we now call the Indian boundary lines were set, the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, and the Treaty of Chicago in 1833. All of those just ceded more land. And by the Treaty of 1833, this is the time of the Trail of Tears, though specific Chicago groups weren't on the Trail of Tears, other Potawatomi were. This is when all Native Americans are basically kicked out of the area. The Métis families tried to stay. Again, they were leaders in the community, but racism, if they were Indian, half Indian, quarter Indian, they were Indian, which meant that they faced racism, they faced discrimination. So ultimately by 1840, all the Métis families are gone too. In terms of the value that people got for the land, never did the United States pay full value for the land. The Potawatomi did better than most other tribes. They were good traders. They had worked with the United States a lot and with Yankees a lot. Also, it could never be said that any of these treaties were done completely willingly. This was not something that the indigenous people of the area wanted to happen to them. So now I'm doing very quickly, Indians didn't all go away. They were kicked out, but in the skipping a whole huge amount of indigenous history in the United States. In terms of Chicago, the termination era was the effort by the United States government to get rid of Indian tribes entirely. Part of this was to end federal recognition for a lot of tribes and funding for essential services on a lot of reservations, and to again try and assimilate Indians into the broader white society of the United States. One way they did this was to promise vocational training to Indians on reservations, move them, give them a bus ticket, bring them to Chicago, promise them housing and training. Unfortunately, often, and Chicago was a very popular destination for this, often this The housing wasn't very good. The training wasn't appropriate for them to return to the reservation with what they'd been trained in. And one historian called it replacing rural poverty with urban poverty. That meant that Chicago became a center for American Indian life. It's currently the third largest urban Indian population in the United States. There are 65,000 Native Americans living in the greater metropolitan area of Chicago, representing around 175 tribes. So it is not gone. It's still here, and Chicago is very much a part of Native history, ongoing. So now to leap to African Americans, we have African Americans have, of course, always been here since DuSable, who left in 1790. Old settlers is the term for African Americans who moved here prior to 1910s about. So there were a small fraction of the community. They lived all over the city. During the Great Migration, African Americans came in very large numbers to work in industry prior to World War I, and then through World War I, all the way through the 1960s. A fascinating history of why and how that happened. In terms of housing, they were restricted. Racism grew. There were 78 bombings between 1910 and 1919 of African American homes or realtors who had sold or rented to African Americans. Then in 1919, you had the race riot. And again, you all know all about that. In terms of restricting African Americans to the Black Belt, through the course of the 20th century, you have three main ways that it was done. Restrictive covenants, redlining, and contract buying. And then I'm going to toss in a little information on the GI Bill. So restrictive covenants is what in some ways affects you as an institution most directly. First of all, never did Holy Trinity Lutheran Church sign a restrictive covenant. Restrictive covenants were private legal documents made legal by the Supreme Court, and then in about they started in the 1800s, became very popular after the race riots in 1919, after the Great Migration really was in full swing. They were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1948. So between 1919 and 1948, restrictive covenants were really the way that neighborhoods, individuals, white neighborhoods and individuals, quote unquote, protected themselves from African Americans moving in. Now, the one connection to the Lutheran Church as a whole that I have so far found is the Elm Street Trust. The Elm Street Trust was a restrictive covenant that covers all of the near north side, and you can see on the map what that covenant covered. This is the language of this on the left side. If you were a homeowner or a business, you signed this if you lived in this area. And this is the language that's used in almost all the restrictive covenants. This was boilerplate language. They all used it. It was considered legal because it was a private agreement between real estate owners, businesses, and residences. And it does, as you can see, I'm not going to read it, but it does clearly specify that no Black person other than a servant can live or rent for any reason in the area. And the connection to the Lutheran Church as a whole is that it was signed by the Chicago Deaconess Home and by Passavant Memorial Hospital Auxiliary because they were in the neighborhood. Everybody in the neighborhood did it. So this, I think, this is just what people did. Or what white people did. Okay, so now moving on to redlining. I'm sure you all have heard the term. It started with the FHA in the 1930s. The FHA created maps. Those maps were used by banks and by real estate agents, banks to support mortgages. So essentially, if you were in a red area, a red-lined area, you would not really be able to get a mortgage because the FHA wouldn't support that mortgage. It wouldn't back that mortgage. And a lot of reasons why a neighborhood would be red or yellow. You all were yellow. Your current building. So you could be red because it was, broken down, overcrowded, all of these other things. But you would be red if you were middle, even if you were a middle class, if you were Black. So this, I've shown you on the upper right, your neighborhood in yellow. And then in the middle here, this D75, which is red, was a neighborhood on the south side, which was essentially a middle-class Black neighborhood. It's, and this description here shows that it was, you know, for people in the middle class, for African Americans, the middle class was post office clerks and Pullman porters. Probably also lawyers and doctors, though the makers of the maps wouldn't have mentioned this, but it was still redlined. So this was a way that African Americans were limited in where they could live and therefore in the real estate wealth that they could accumulate. All right, and now moving to the post-war, or if I don't know if people can see on the right side of the screen or if everybody's faces are, for me, they're there. I'm just going to move you over here. Contract buying is what came into play after, of course, the redlining still existed, but after restrictive covenants were declared illegal by the Supreme Court. Contract buying. So you have the combination of no FHA loan, no real, no banks are giving people mortgages. So African Americans who wanted to buy a home bought the home on contract. Often this is again an agreement, a private agreement. It's not supported by the FHA. And this contract meant that these people who thought that they had purchased a home had absolutely no equity in their home, which meant that they could be paying off that home for 10 years. And if they missed a payment, they could be evicted and they would have no equity in that building. The real estate and contract brokers, I should say, the contract brokers who did this would go into a white neighborhood that was fearful that Blacks were going to move in, scare the white people to sell it for, to sell under the value of their home, and then sell at at very highly inflated prices to Black people who wanted to move in. So then by the early 1960s, 85% of the properties that were owned by African Americans in Chicago were on contract. There's a wonderful documentary called Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation. This is one of their episodes, and it really talks about how this happened and how it was fought in the late 1960s, early 1970s. That same documentary calculated that $3.2 to $4 billion was lost by Black homeowners just in Chicago. And contract buying happened all over the country. I haven't been keeping track of time, so I hope I'm not too far over. Then finally, the GI Bill. 1.2 million Black men served in World War II. The GI Bill was definitely written to be race neutral, but it was implemented by the states. And the reason why it was written to be implemented by the states is one of the writers of the bill was a white supremacist senator from the Deep South. So the states could do what they could implement it how they wanted to implement the GI Bill. And also the GI Bill followed FHA rules, which means that the GI Bill followed redlining. So again, the opportunity for white Americans to build wealth and to build the middle class in the 1950s was not equaled by African Americans who didn't have the same access to being able, they weren't allowed to buy in Levittown or Daly City. The FHA wouldn't have funded Levittown and Daly City if it had allowed African Americans to move there. And there's a great book on that as well. I've got some of these listed in the last thing, in the last slide. So now let me move forward. So finally, African American housing today. Still, there are issues. Black homes are routinely appraised for less than white-owned homes. This is a Brookings Institute study They're undervalued on average $48,000 per home. This adds up to $156 billion in cumulative losses. This is, and I don't trust a lot of statistics, so it was important for me to read that homes of the same size, quality, with comparable socioeconomic status and location were used to come to these, to come up to these numbers. So it wasn't looking at a 3 flat that's, falling down on the south side and a, 4-bedroom single family home on the north side. That's not what they were doing. In Chicago, the percentage difference is about 28% less. And there are also still issues with racism when it comes to acquiring mortgages. There's even, and in terms of the appraisal, there's even a company now, I'm not sure he started it, but he was thinking of starting it in Chicago, a company by a Black realtor who was going to help African Americans de-black their houses before their appraisals, so that they could get the appraisal that it should have if the appraiser thought it was white owned. So that's an interesting side thing. And then the last point is just, these are some of, I think, interesting sources. They're all linked in the slideshow, but I can also provide the URLs for them. These are just some great places to start to look at some of these issues. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mac.
Yeah, thank you.
And I can stop sharing now.
That's an awful lot of information.
Yeah, I
No,
apologize. I feel
not
as
just,
though I've
don't
just sort of
apologize.
thrown a lot of things at everybody, but
From everyone, from both you and Dina, that's just a lot of really helpful information. Questions and people that, what would you like clarified, or what is this making you think about? You can put things in the chat. You can certainly unmute and just ask your question. We definitely have time for that. Anything unclear? Like maybe you didn't know the term racial redlining. It's not like it's
yes.
inherently in our vocabularies. Right. Thank you, Chris. We were going to stop the recording so that you could speak freely and not worry about being on display for infinity. So Pastor Craig, can you do that? I think